The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle, as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the window of their private quarters. Her fingers traced the outline of the glass while she watched the gardeners tend to the roses below. William had been unusually quiet during breakfast, pushing his eggs around his plate without taking a proper bite. She knew something was weighing heavily on his mind. But royal protocol had taught them both to maintain composure, even in their most private moments. The telephone call had come 3 days earlier. William had answered it in his study, and Catherine had heard his voice change from its usual warm tone to something strained and formal. When he emerged an hour later, his face was pale, and he had asked her to sit down. The words he spoke that evening would change everything they had built together over the past 2 decades. "There's been a development with the succession," William had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Parliament has made a decision that will require us to step back from our roles permanently." Catherine had felt the world tilt beneath her feet. They had dedicated their entire adult lives to serving the crown and the Commonwealth. Their children had grown up, understanding their destiny was tied to the monarchy. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been prepared from birth for lives of duty and service. Now, suddenly, that future was being taken away from them through no fault of their own. The constitutional crisis had been brewing for months, though the public remained largely unaware of the behind-the-scenes negotiations. A series of parliamentary reviews had questioned the modern relevance of hereditary succession, and pressure from various political factions had reached a boiling point. The decision to transition to an elected ceremonial presidency had been made in closed sessions, with little input from the royal family themselves. William had spent the past 3 days in constant meetings with constitutional lawyers, private secretaries, and government officials. The transition would happen gradually over the next 6 months, but their active roles would end immediately. They would retain their titles temporarily, but lose all official duties, patronages, and state funding. Most painfully, they would need to leave their royal residences and find private accommodation for their family. Catherine had watched her husband struggle with emotions he had rarely been permitted to express publicly. The weight of generations of royal duty pressed down on his shoulders, and she could see him questioning everything he had been taught about service, responsibility, and his place in British society. He had been groomed since childhood to be king, and now, that future had vanished like morning mist. The children had taken the news with the resilience that had been instilled in them from an early age, but Catherine could see the confusion in their eyes. George, at 21, had been preparing for his eventual role as heir. Charlotte and Louis, now teenagers, had built their identities around being working members of the royal family. The adjustment would be profound for all of them. Their staff had been informed yesterday morning. Many had served the royal household for decades, and several had broken down in tears upon hearing the news. Mrs. Henderson, their longtime housekeeper, had simply nodded and continued polishing the silver. But Catherine had noticed her hands shaking. The ripple effects of this decision would impact hundreds of people who had devoted their careers to royal service. The media remained unaware of the impending announcement. Palace officials had managed to maintain absolute secrecy while final arrangements were being made. Catherine knew that once the news broke, their lives would never be the same. The scrutiny they had endured as working royals would seem gentle compared to the feeding frenzy that would follow this unprecedented constitutional change. William joined her at the window, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for several minutes as they watched the familiar routines of palace life continuing below. The guards still changed with precision timing. Tourists still gathered at the gates, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. And the Union Jack still flew proudly above their heads. "I keep thinking about my grandmother," William finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "She devoted 70 years of her life to this institution. My father waited his entire life to become king, only to serve for such a short time before this happened. Sometimes I wonder if we've failed them somehow." Catherine turned to face him, seeing the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "You haven't failed anyone," she said firmly. You've served with dignity and dedication for over 20 years. The circumstances that led to this decision were beyond our control. History will remember how you conducted yourself during this transition. The irony was not lost on either of them that their popularity with the British public had never been higher. Recent polls had shown them to be the most beloved members of the royal family, with approval ratings that politicians could only dream of achieving. Their charity work had touched millions of lives, their environmental initiatives had gained international recognition, and their parenting had been praised as a modern example of royal family life. But popular opinion had not been enough to counter the political momentum that had been building behind constitutional reform. The cost of maintaining the monarchy during economic hardship, questions about democratic legitimacy, and pressure from Republican movements across the Commonwealth had created a perfect storm of circumstances that made change inevitable. The couple had discussed their options extensively over the past few days. They could fight the decision through legal channels, but their advisors had made it clear that such a battle would likely prove futile and would only create more negative publicity for the institution they still loved. They could speak out publicly against the transition, but doing so would go against every principle of political neutrality they had been taught to uphold. Instead, they had chosen to handle their departure with the same grace and dignity that had characterized their entire royal careers. They would make their final public appearance tomorrow at a specially convened ceremony where William would formally relinquish his position as heir to the throne. The speech he would deliver had been written and rewritten dozens of times, each draft attempting to capture the complexity of their emotions while maintaining the composure expected of royalty. Catherine had spent hours helping him craft the words that would mark the end of an era. They wanted to express gratitude for the privilege of service while acknowledging the legitimate concerns that had led to this moment. Most importantly, they wanted to demonstrate their continued love for Britain and the Commonwealth, even as they stepped away from their official roles. The logistics of their departure were overwhelming. Centuries of protocol had to be unwound in a matter of weeks. State jewelry would be returned, official residences would be vacated, and hundreds of patronages would need to find new royal patrons or transition to different structures entirely. Each decision required careful consideration of precedent, law, and diplomatic sensitivity. Their personal belongings, accumulated over years of royal life, would need to be sorted and packed. Wedding gifts from world leaders, family heirlooms, and personal photographs would all need to be carefully catalogued. Some items belonged to the crown and would remain in royal collections, while others were personal property they could take with them into their new life. The financial implications were staggering. Without the Duchy of Cornwall income and sovereign grant funding, they would need to establish an entirely new economic foundation for their family. William's military pension would provide some security, but nothing compared to the resources they had become accustomed to managing. They had already begun discussions with financial advisors about how to maintain their charitable commitments and staff employment during the transition. Perhaps most challenging was explaining the situation to their extended family and closest friends. The royal family had always presented a united front publicly, but this decision had created private tensions that would take years to resolve. Some family members felt betrayed by the political forces that had driven this change, while others saw it as an inevitable evolution of British democracy. Catherine had found unexpected strength in focusing on the practical details of their transition. She had always been the planner in their relationship, the one who thought through logistics and potential complications. Now those skills were being put to the ultimate test as they prepared to rebuild their entire lives from scratch. The couple had already begun reaching out to old friends from their university days and military service, people who had known them before titles and protocol shaped their daily interactions. These relationships would become crucial as they navigated life outside the royal bubble. They would need to learn how to shop for groceries, book restaurants, and travel without the elaborate security and logistical support they had grown accustomed to over the past 2 decades. Their children's education would need to be reconsidered as well. Private schools that had been honored to educate future royals might view them differently now. University plans that had been made with royal duties in mind would need to be completely restructured. George's gap year activities, Charlotte's A-level choices, and Louis's secondary school selection all took on new significance in light of their changed circumstances. As evening approached on this final day before their public announcement, Catherine found herself walking through the staterooms one last time. Each painting, each piece of furniture, each window had been part of her daily life for so many years. She paused in the music room, where Charlotte had played piano for distinguished guests, remembering the pride she had felt watching her daughter represent the royal family with such poise and talent. The weight of history seemed to press down on her as she realized that she and William would be the last generation to call these rooms home in the way they had known them. Future occupants would be different kinds of public servants, elected rather than born to their roles. The traditions and ceremonies that had shaped their lives would become museum pieces, historical curiosities rather than living practices. Yet even in her sadness, Catherine felt a sense of anticipation about their future. For the first time in their adult lives, they would have the freedom to make choices without considering constitutional implications or royal protocol. They could travel where they wanted, speak their minds on issues they cared about, and pursue careers based on personal passion rather than dynastic duty. The children, too, would have opportunities that previous generations of royals could never have imagined. They could choose universities based on academic merit rather than tradition, pursue careers in any field that interested them, and marry for love without consideration of bloodlines or political alliances. In some ways, this unexpected freedom might prove to be the greatest gift they could give their children. The morning of the announcement dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself understood the solemnity of the occasion. Catherine stood before her wardrobe, considering what one wore to mark the end of a 1,000-year tradition. She selected a navy dress that had always been one of William's favorites, paired with the sapphire earrings that had belonged to his grandmother. If this was to be her final official appearance as a working royal, she wanted to honor the women who had walked this path before her. The ceremony would take place at Westminster Abbey, the same ancient stones that had witnessed coronations, weddings, and state funerals for centuries. The irony was not lost on either of them that they would be saying goodbye in the very place where they had pledged their lives to each other 14 years earlier. The guest list had been carefully curated to include representatives from Parliament, the Commonwealth realms, military leaders, and heads of their various charities. George had returned from university the night before, his face bearing a maturity that seemed to have appeared overnight. At 21, he was old enough to understand the full implications of what was happening to their family. Charlotte and Louis had insisted on attending despite their parents' initial reluctance to expose them to what would undoubtedly be an emotionally charged event. The family breakfast that morning was unusually quiet, with each member lost in their own thoughts about what the day would bring. Mrs. Henderson had prepared William's favorite kippers and eggs, perhaps for the last time in a royal residence. The morning newspapers remained unread on the sideboard. Palace staff had been instructed to keep all media away until after the official announcement. William had barely slept the night before, running through his speech repeatedly in his mind. The words needed to strike an impossible balance, acknowledging the pain of this transition, while respecting the democratic process that had led to it, expressing gratitude for their years of service, while avoiding any hint of bitterness about their forced departure. Catherine had found him in his study at dawn, staring out at the gardens where they had hosted countless garden parties and receptions. She understood that he was not just mourning the end of his royal career, but grieving for an entire way of life that was disappearing. The Britain they had served was changing in ways that made hereditary monarchy seem like an anachronism, no matter how beloved individual royals might be. Their security detail had been quietly doubled for the day, though this would be one of their final acts of protection. Once they stepped back from official duties, their government-funded security would be dramatically reduced. They had already begun discussions about private security arrangements, another reminder of how completely their lives were about to change. The drive to Westminster Abbey took them through streets lined with curious onlookers who had heard rumors of an important announcement but had no idea of its true significance. Catherine watched the familiar landmarks of London pass by her window, wondering how different these streets would look when she was no longer viewing them through the windows of an official royal car. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and confusion. Most of the invited guests had received their invitations with minimal explanation, knowing only that the Prince and Princess of Wales had requested their presence for a ceremony of significant constitutional importance. The Archbishop of Canterbury looked particularly troubled as he consulted with palace officials about the unprecedented nature of the occasion. The royal family took their places with the same precision that had characterized their public appearances for decades. The Queen Consort appeared fragile, but determined, her face a mask of composed resignation. Other family members showed varying degrees of understanding about what was about to unfold. Some had been briefed in advance, while others would learn the full truth along with the watching world. When William rose to approach the lectern, the silence in the ancient building was absolute. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat as she watched her husband prepare to deliver the most important speech of his life. He had removed his military medals that morning, choosing instead to wear a simple dark suit that reflected the civilian future he was about to embrace. "My fellow citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth," William began, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted space. "I stand before you today to announce a decision that will fundamentally change the nature of our constitutional monarchy. After extensive consultation with Parliament, the government, and the royal family, I am here to formally relinquish my position as heir to the throne and to announce the beginning of a transition to an elected head of state." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Catherine could see guests throughout the abbey struggling to process what they had just heard. Television cameras captured every reaction, every gasp of surprise, every tear that began to fall from the eyes of those who had devoted their lives to royal service. William continued with the poise that had been drilled into him since childhood, explaining the constitutional process that had led to this moment and the timeline for the transition. He spoke about the changing nature of democracy, the legitimate questions about hereditary privilege, and the need for institutions to evolve with the times. But it was when he began to speak about service that his voice began to crack with emotion. "Catherine and I have been privileged beyond measure to serve this nation and the Commonwealth for over 20 years. We have traveled to every corner of our realm, met with citizens from every walk of life, and tried always to use our positions to make a positive difference in the world." Catherine felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she listened to her husband's words. She thought about the countless hospital visits, school openings, charity galas, and state ceremonies that had filled their calendars year after year. Each event had been an opportunity to connect with people, to hear their stories, and to use their platform to highlight important causes. "We leave our official roles with no bitterness, only gratitude," William continued. "Gratitude for the trust you have placed in us, for the opportunities we have had to serve, and for the countless people who have supported us along the way. Our children have grown up understanding that service to others is the highest calling, and that lesson will guide them regardless of their official titles." The ceremony continued with formal statements from the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Each speaker attempted to capture the historical significance of the moment, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to such a solemn occasion. The Prime Minister praised William and Catherine's years of dedicated service, while explaining the democratic principles that had necessitated this constitutional change. Catherine found herself studying the faces in the congregation, many of whom had become like family over the years of royal engagements. She saw her patronage's representatives, military officers who had served alongside William, and charity workers whose causes had been championed by the royal couple. Each face told a story of lives that had been touched by their work. When the formal ceremony concluded, the family made their way to a private reception where they could speak more personally with their guests. These conversations were some of the most difficult of the day, as longtime supporters struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of what was happening. General Harrison, who had served alongside William in his military career, simply embraced his former colleague without speaking. Mrs. Patel from the children's charity that had been Catherine's first patronage wept openly as she thanked the princess for years of unwavering support. These personal moments meant more to the royal couple than all the formal speeches and constitutional explanations. The children handled themselves with remarkable composure throughout the day, shaking hands and accepting condolences with the same grace their parents had demonstrated. Charlotte, in particular, seemed to understand that she was witnessing history and conducted herself with a poise that made Catherine enormously proud. As the official events of the day concluded, The family returned to Windsor for what would be one of their final evenings in their longtime home. The weight of the day's events seemed to settle on all of them as they gathered in their private sitting room, still dressed in their formal clothes but finally able to speak freely about their emotions. William slumped into his favorite chair, the physical and emotional exhaustion of the day evident in every line of his body. Catherine sat beside him, taking his hand in hers as they processed what they had just experienced together. The children arranged themselves around the room, creating an intimate family circle that felt both familiar and different. "I'm proud of how you handled today," Catherine told William softly. "Your speech was perfect. You managed to be honest about our feelings, while still respecting the process and the institutions involved." Louis, now 16 and remarkably thoughtful for his age, broke the comfortable silence. "Will people still remember what you accomplished?" He asked. "All the charities you helped, the places you visited, the changes you made?" William smiled at his youngest son, recognizing in him the same concern for others that had always motivated their royal work. "I hope so," he replied. "But more importantly, the work itself will continue. The causes we've supported will find new champions, and the changes we've helped implement will outlast any titles we might have held." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared as a family before. Freed from the constraints of royal protocol, they could finally discuss their feelings openly. Charlotte admitted that she had sometimes resented the restrictions of royal life, but was sad to lose the platform it had given her to promote mental health awareness among young people. George revealed that he had been struggling with anxiety about his future role for years, and while he was sad about the circumstances, he felt relief about no longer having that pressure. Louis confessed that he had always wondered what it would be like to have a normal life, and was curious about the opportunities that might now be available to him. Catherine found herself thinking about the women who had held her position before her. The Queen Mother, who had never expected to be royal but had embraced her role with grace during World War II. Queen Elizabeth II, who had devoted her entire adult life to duty and service. She wondered what they would have thought about this moment, about the decision to step away from centuries of tradition. The practical implications of their new situation began to assert themselves as the evening progressed. They would need to find new schools for the children, new homes for their family, and new careers for themselves. The transition period would last 6 months, but many of the changes would begin immediately. Their security detail had already been reduced to a minimum level, and they had been warned that media interest in their private lives would likely intensify rather than diminish in the short term. The public would be fascinated by how they adapted to life outside the royal bubble, and every shopping trip or restaurant visit would potentially become front-page news. William had already received several informal job offers from universities, think tanks, and charitable organizations. His military experience and years of royal duties had given him skills that were valuable in many contexts. Catherine had been approached by publishers interested in her thoughts on royal life and child development, though she was not yet ready to consider such opportunities. The couple had made a decision early in the process that they would not profit directly from their royal experiences through tell-all books or exclusive interviews. They felt that maintaining some level of discretion about their years of service was important for the institution they were leaving, even if they no longer represented it officially. As the family prepared to retire for the evening, each member seemed to understand that this was a turning point, not just in their public roles but in their personal relationships with each other. The shared experience of this dramatic change had brought them closer together, while simultaneously forcing them to confront questions about identity and purpose that they had never needed to consider before. Catherine spent a long time that night, looking through photo albums that chronicled their years of royal service. Images from their wedding day, overseas tours, charity events, and family occasions told the story of a life lived in service to others. Tomorrow would begin the process of building a new story, one written without the constraints and privileges of royal birth, but hopefully with the same commitment to making a positive difference in the world. 6 months later, Catherine stood in the doorway of their new home, a restored Georgian farmhouse in the Cotswolds that they had purchased with their private funds. The morning sun streamed through windows that she had personally chosen, illuminating rooms that belonged entirely to her family, without any constitutional strings attached. For the first time, in over 2 decades, she was simply Mrs. Wales, a private citizen of the United Kingdom. The transition had been more challenging than any of them had anticipated. The media attention during their final months as working royals had been relentless, with photographers camping outside their temporary accommodation and following the children to their schools. Every mundane activity, from grocery shopping to walking the dogs, had become newsworthy, simply because they were no longer protected by the usual royal security protocols. William had struggled the most with the adjustment. Despite his intellectual understanding of the reasons for the constitutional change, the emotional reality of losing his life's purpose had hit him harder than he had expected. He had spent weeks in a state of depression that worried Catherine deeply. The man who had always been driven by duty and service seemed lost without the structure that royal life had provided. Their marriage had been tested in ways that 20 years of royal scrutiny had never managed to achieve. Without the shared mission of royal duties to unite them, they had been forced to rediscover who they were as individuals and as a couple. There had been difficult conversations about resentment, regret, and the future they had never planned for. The children had adapted with the resilience of youth, though each had faced their own unique challenges. George had decided to take a gap year from university to help his parents with the transition and to figure out his own path forward. Without the expectation of royal duties in his future, he had begun exploring interests in environmental science and sustainable technology that had never been practical options before. Charlotte had thrown herself into her A-level studies with renewed intensity, relieved to be just another student rather than a royal princess. She had been accepted to several prestigious universities based entirely on her academic merit, an achievement that meant more to her than any ceremonial role ever could have. The freedom to choose her own path had been both liberating and overwhelming. Louis had perhaps struggled the most with the loss of royal identity. At 16, he had been old enough to understand what they were losing, but young enough to feel the absence of structure and purpose that royal life had provided. He had acted out for several months, testing the boundaries of their new normal life in ways that had never been possible under royal protocols. The financial adjustment had been dramatic but manageable. William had accepted a position as a senior fellow at Cambridge University, focusing on sustainable development and mental health initiatives. His years of royal experience had given him credibility in these fields, and the academic environment provided the intellectual stimulation he had always craved, but had been unable to pursue fully. While bound by royal neutrality, Catherine had been more cautious about taking on official roles, preferring to focus on the family's adjustment and on exploring opportunities that genuinely interested her, rather than simply accepting the highest-profile offers. She had begun writing a book about child development, drawing on her years of visiting schools and children's charities, as well as her own experience raising 3 children in extraordinary circumstances. The couple had maintained their commitment to charitable work, though in dramatically different ways than before. Without the platform of royal patronages, they had needed to find new methods of supporting the causes they cared about. William had joined the boards of several environmental organizations, while Catherine had become involved with a foundation supporting families in transition. Their relationship with the remaining members of the royal family had evolved in complex ways. Some family members had initially felt betrayed by the constitutional changes, as if William and Catherine had chosen to abandon their duties rather than having those duties taken away by political forces beyond their control. Others had been surprisingly supportive, understanding that the couple had handled an impossible situation with as much grace as possible. The new elected head of state had been chosen through a process that combined parliamentary selection with public consultation. Dr. Sarah Richardson, a former Supreme Court judge and respected constitutional scholar, had been elected to serve as the first president of the United Kingdom. She had reached out to William and Catherine early in her term to express gratitude for their years of service and to seek their advice on maintaining the ceremonial aspects of the role that the public valued. The coronation ceremony for the new president had been a strange experience for the former royal couple. They had been invited as honored guests, watching from the congregation as someone else took on the constitutional role that William had been born to fulfill. The ceremony had been deliberately different from royal coronations, emphasizing democratic values and citizen service rather than divine right and hereditary privilege. Public opinion about the constitutional change had remained divided long after the transition was complete. Polls showed that while a majority of citizens supported the move to an elected head of state in principle, many regretted the loss of William and Catherine specifically. Their approval ratings as private citizens remained remarkably high, with many people expressing hope that they would find ways to continue serving the public good. The international reaction had been equally complex. Some Commonwealth realms had followed Britain's lead in transitioning away from hereditary monarchy, while others had retained the traditional system. The diplomatic implications of these changes had created ongoing tensions that would take years to resolve fully. William and Catherine had been careful to avoid commenting publicly on the political aspects of the transition, maintaining the neutrality that had been ingrained in them during their years of royal service. However, they had spoken thoughtfully about the personal aspects of change, adaptation, and finding purpose beyond traditional structures. Their new home had become a symbol of their transformed life. The Georgian farmhouse sat on 50 acres of countryside, providing privacy and space for the family to heal and grow in ways that had never been possible in royal residences. They had installed solar panels and a wind turbine, turning their property into a model of sustainable living that reflected William's environmental passions. Catherine had discovered a love of gardening that had been impossible to pursue fully while managing royal schedules. She spent hours each morning tending to vegetables and flowers, finding in the soil and seasons a peace that official engagements had never provided. The physical work of caring for growing things had become a form of meditation that helped her process the enormous changes in their lives. The family dinner table conversations had become more honest and intimate than they had ever been during their years of royal service. Without the need to maintain public facades, the children felt free to express doubts, fears, and dreams that had been suppressed by protocol and expectation. George had admitted to feeling relief about no longer carrying the weight of future kingship, while Charlotte had revealed her excitement about pursuing a career in psychology without royal constraints. William had begun to find his footing again as he adjusted to his academic role. The freedom to speak his mind on environmental and social issues within the bounds of his university position had rekindled the passion for advocacy that had been carefully constrained during his royal years. He was working on research projects that combined his royal experiences with academic rigor in ways that were producing genuinely innovative insights. The couple had also begun to rebuild their social circle, reconnecting with old friends who had been kept at arm's length by royal protocol, and making new friendships based on shared interests rather than constitutional obligations. They had been surprised to discover how hungry they were for relationships that were not shaped by their former status. Their marriage had emerged stronger from the crisis of transition, though it had taken months of counseling and honest communication to reach that point. The shared trauma of losing their public roles had ultimately brought them closer together, forcing them to rediscover the love and partnership that had existed before royal duties shaped their every interaction. The children had begun to thrive in ways that had been impossible under the scrutiny of royal life. George had started a small environmental consulting firm with friends from university, focusing on sustainable practices for rural communities. Charlotte had been elected student body president at her sixth form college, using the leadership skills learned through royal engagements while pursuing her own vision, rather than following royal precedent. Louis had found his passion in music production, spending hours in the studio they had built in one of the farm buildings. The creativity that had been suppressed by royal expectations had flourished once he was free to explore artistic expression without considering its appropriateness for a prince. The family had established new traditions that reflected their changed circumstances, while honoring the values that had guided them through their royal years. Sunday dinners had become sacred time for discussion and planning, while Saturday mornings were dedicated to working together on the farm and property maintenance. They had also begun to travel differently, taking family vacations that were planned for personal enjoyment rather than diplomatic necessity. A recent trip to Scotland had allowed them to hike and explore in ways that would have been impossible with royal security requirements and official schedules. As Catherine reflected on their journey from Buckingham Palace to this Cotswolds farmhouse, she felt a complex mixture of sadness and gratitude. They had lost a way of life that had defined them for decades, but they had gained something equally valuable: the freedom to choose their own path, and the opportunity to discover who they were beyond their titles. The world had indeed remembered their goodbye, but more importantly, it was beginning to see how people could reinvent themselves with dignity and purpose, even after experiencing profound loss. Their story had become one of resilience, adaptation, and the possibility of finding meaning beyond traditional structures of power and privilege. Looking toward the future, Catherine felt cautiously optimistic. They had survived the most difficult transition imaginable, and had emerged as a stronger family unit. Their children were becoming remarkable young adults who combined the best lessons of royal service with the freedom to pursue their own dreams. William was rediscovering his passion for making a difference in the world through different but equally meaningful channels. The goodbye that the world had witnessed at Westminster Abbey had been an ending, but it had also been a beginning. They were writing a new chapter of their lives, one that honored their past while embracing possibilities they had never imagined. The tears shed that day had been tears of genuine loss, but also tears of liberation from expectations and constraints that had shaped them for so long. As she closed the door of their new home and prepared for another day of this different but fulfilling life, Catherine smiled at the thought that their greatest service to the crown might have been showing grace in leaving it behind. Their story would inspire others facing unexpected change to find strength in adaptation and hope in new beginnings.